On May 20th, 1969, a soldier from the 101st Airborne Division stood on the summit of a mountain his unit had just taken for the 10th time. Instead of victory, he felt something closer to disbelief that it was finally actually over. His battalion had assaulted this same hill 9 times before this final attack, each attempt beaten back by North Vietnamese soldiers dug into fighting positions so well prepared, so deeply bunkered, that American artillery and airstrikes, pounding the same ground for days, had failed to dislodge them. He had watched friends carried down the slope on ponchos, some dead, most wounded, after each failed attempt. He had heard more than once in the days leading up to this final assault other soldiers in his own company say quietly that they were finished, that they would not go back up that hill again, no matter what any officer ordered. He went up anyway, on the 10th attempt, alongside men who felt exactly the same exhaustion and doubt he did, because that was simply what the job required. Whatever any of them privately believed about whether the hill itself was actually worth what it was costing them. When the position finally fell, hours into that last assault, there was no cheering, no sense of triumph that matched the scale of what getting there had actually required. There was only the exhausted, hollow relief of men who had survived something they had genuinely, quietly begun to believe might kill them all before it ended. He could not know, standing on that summit, that his own commander's radio call sign would become infamous within days, quoted in newspapers across the United States by soldiers who had grown to resent the man ordering them back up that hill again and again. He could not know that the hill itself, taken at this cost, would be abandoned by American forces within a matter of weeks, or that the battle he had just survived would become one of the defining symbols of a war the American public was rapidly losing patience with. He knew only that the men around him had started calling this hill something else entirely, a name that had nothing to do with its official designation and everything to do with what 10 assaults up the same slope had actually felt like. That is the story of the objective American soldiers themselves, named after a machine built to grind flesh into something else entirely. Now let me show you exactly how it earned that name. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why this particular hill, among the hundreds of contested pieces of ground fought over throughout that war, became the one that earned this specific grim nickname, you first have to understand exactly what made it so difficult to take. To understand why American soldiers gave this objective the name they did, you have to understand the specific tactical problem this piece of ground actually represented, because it was not simply another difficult hill in a war full of difficult terrain. Ap Bia Mountain, designated Hill 937 on American military maps, rose from the floor of the Shau Valley near the Laotian border, a stretch of terrain North Vietnamese forces had used for years as a staging area and infiltration route into South Vietnam. In May 1969, as part of a larger operation designed to disrupt this activity, elements of the 101st Airborne Division, including the 3rd Battalion of the 187th Infantry Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, moved into the valley and made contact with the North Vietnamese forces on the lower slopes of the mountain. What began as a routine engagement in a routine operation quickly revealed itself to be something considerably more serious. The North Vietnamese 29th Regiment had prepared the mountain's defenses with real skill and real patience, building bunkers and fighting positions, dug deep enough and reinforced well enough to survive American artillery and airstrikes that would have destroyed less carefully constructed defenses many times over. This was disciplined, professional military engineering built by soldiers who understood exactly what kind of firepower they would eventually face and had prepared accordingly over what must have been considerable time and effort, well before Honeycutt's battalion ever arrived at the base of the mountain. Over the following days, Honeycutt's battalion attempted assault after assault against these positions, each one repulsed by North Vietnamese defenders who held their ground with real discipline against attacks supported by exactly the kind of overwhelming firepower that had, in so many other engagements throughout the war, proven decisive. This was not a case of American forces failing to bring adequate force to bear. It was a case of North Vietnamese defenses proving genuinely, remarkably resilient against force that, in nearly any other engagement of that war, would have settled the outcome considerably faster. What happened over the following 10 days as Honeycutt's battalion and eventually reinforcements from across the division attempted to finally take this position produced the specific grinding pattern of repeated costly assault that gave the hill its eventual name. The pattern repeated with grim consistency. American forces would assault the North Vietnamese positions, supported by artillery and air support, make some initial progress up the slope, and then be stopped by defenders who simply would not break, absorbing the supporting fire in positions built specifically to survive it, and answering with disciplined, accurate defensive fire of their own. An assault launched on May 13th was repulsed. Another attempt the following day came close to the summit before the lead company's commander was wounded and the attack lost its momentum, forced to withdraw once again down a slope already littered with casualties from the attempts before it. Documented accounts from soldiers who lived through this specific stretch of fighting describe a morale genuinely, visibly deteriorating with each failed attempt, distinct from the ordinary fear and exhaustion of combat. One soldier, speaking to a reporter covering the battle, described morale in his company as lower than he had ever experienced, specifically because the repeated failures had begun to feel senseless, disconnected from any clear sense that the cost being paid matched any proportionate strategic value. This was not simple fear of danger, which every soldier in that war understood and had learned to live with. It was something closer to a collapsing faith that the specific danger being faced over and over against the same unyielding position actually made sense. Honeycutt himself, a demanding and hard-driving commander who frequently moved with his forward elements rather than directing the battle from the rear, pushed his battalion to continue the assault despite mounting casualties that eventually reached roughly 60% of the unit's strength. When his division commander, Major General Melvin Zayas, moved to relieve the exhausted battalion and bring in fresh reinforcements, Honeycutt reportedly protested the decision, wanting his own men to complete what they had already paid so much to attempt. This friction between a commander determined to finish what his unit had started and a higher command increasingly concerned about the mounting cost reflects the genuine, difficult tension running through the entire battle by this point. Now understand exactly how this specific hill earned the particular nickname that would eventually become far more famous than its official military designation, because the name itself captured something the men fighting there felt with real, unmistakable clarity. Soldiers who lived through the repeated assaults began referring to the hill informally in the blunt, dark language soldiers use for exactly this kind of grinding, costly experience as a meat grinder, a machine built for nothing except reducing whatever entered it into something smaller and less recognizable over and over without any evident concern for the cost. The name captured, with brutal precision, exactly what the experience of assaulting this position repeatedly actually felt like from inside it. Not a single decisive battle, but a mechanical, repeating process that consumed men and produced casualties with a regularity that felt less like combat and more like an industrial process nobody involved had actually chosen to be part of. This name spread quickly among the soldiers fighting there, and it reached the journalists covering the battle almost as fast, becoming the term used in press coverage back in the United States even as the fighting itself continued. This mattered enormously to how the battle was eventually understood by the American public, because a name this vivid and this blunt did more to communicate the actual human cost of the fighting than any official casualty report or military communique ever could have managed on its own. Readers who saw this name in their newspapers understood immediately and viscerally exactly what kind of fighting had actually taken place on that mountain without needing any further explanation of the tactical details involved. And there was a second related phrase that emerged from the same fighting and became almost equally well known, attached specifically to Honeycutt's own radio call sign. Soldiers frustrated by the repeated, costly assaults began quoting to reporters and to each other variations on a specific complaint about their own commander's determination to keep attacking regardless of the mounting cost. One wounded trooper telling a journalist directly that the commander known by that call sign would not stop until he had gotten every one of them killed. This quote, printed in American newspapers within days of the battle's conclusion, attached a specific personal face to the broader frustration the meat grinder nickname had already begun to capture. The battle finally concluded on May 20th, when a massive, coordinated assault involving multiple battalions, including fresh reinforcements brought in specifically to finish what Honeycutt's exhausted original force could no longer manage alone, finally overwhelmed the North Vietnamese defenses and secured the summit. The cost of reaching that outcome was real and substantial, documented across multiple contemporary accounts, with figures that vary somewhat depending on exactly which portion of the broader campaign is being counted. But that consistently describe dozens of American dead and several hundred wounded across the full engagement. North Vietnamese losses by American estimates were considerably higher, with a documented body count exceeding 600 and some contemporary assessments suggesting the true figure, including wounded who could not be counted, ran considerably higher still. By the narrow mathematics of a casualty exchange, the battle looked, on paper, like exactly the kind of favorable ratio American commanders had spent years citing as evidence that the broader war of attrition was working as intended. What happened next revealed exactly how little that favorable ratio actually mattered, both strategically and politically, by this specific point in the war. On June 5th, barely more than 2 weeks after American forces had paid such a heavy price to take the summit, the decision was made to abandon Ap Bia Mountain entirely, the position having served whatever limited tactical purpose the broader operation required, and holding no further strategic value once that purpose had been served. American forces withdrew, and the hill, taken at such enormous cost, simply reverted to whatever use North Vietnamese forces chose to make of it once American troops had left. This abandonment, arriving so soon after the battle's costly conclusion, transformed public and political reaction to the engagement from concern into something closer to genuine outrage. The same week the withdrawal was announced, a major American magazine published a photo essay featuring the faces of hundreds of American service members killed in Vietnam over a single recent week, a piece of journalism that landed with devastating impact precisely because it arrived alongside news that a hill so many of those men had died attempting to take had simply been given up weeks later. The combination of these two stories appearing in the American press within days of each other did more to crystallize public frustration with the war's conduct than almost any single piece of coverage before it. It would be incomplete to end this story without understanding the real, lasting political and strategic consequences this single 10-day battle actually produced, because Hamburger Hill did not simply become a symbol in the abstract. It changed how the war was actually fought for the remainder of its course. Congressional criticism of the battle was swift and pointed, with senior senators publicly questioning the wisdom of ordering repeated, costly frontal assaults against a position of demonstrably limited strategic value, criticism that reflected and amplified a broader shift already underway in how Washington understood the costs and benefits of continued heavy combat operations in Vietnam. This criticism arrived at a politically sensitive moment, with peace negotiations already underway and public patience for exactly this kind of costly, seemingly indecisive engagement wearing increasingly thin after years of similar battles that had produced favorable casualty ratios without ever producing the kind of decisive strategic progress those ratios had once seemed to promise. The practical military consequence proved significant and lasting. In the aftermath of the controversy this battle generated, American commanders grew noticeably more cautious about ordering exactly this kind of costly, repeated frontal assault against heavily defended positions, particularly for objectives whose strategic value could not be clearly and convincingly justified against the human cost of taking them. This shift reflected a broader change already underway in American strategy, moving away from the kind of large-scale search and destroy operations that had characterized earlier years of the war, and toward a policy that would soon be formalized as a deliberate transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, reducing American ground combat exposure specifically in response to exactly the kind of political pressure this battle had helped generate. This honest accounting matters because it demonstrates something this whole series has explored from other angles: the specific relationship between battlefield outcomes and the political will required to sustain them. Hamburger Hill was not, by the narrow military mathematics of the casualty exchange, a defeat. It was, by nearly every measure that actually determined how much longer the American public and government were willing to sustain this kind of costly engagement. Something considerably closer to a turning point. Proof that favorable casualty ratios alone had stopped being sufficient justification for the human cost of achieving them. The men who survived those 10 assaults carried the specific memory of that mountain with them for the rest of their lives, and in the years afterward, many of them thought often about the particular, complicated meaning the battle had come to hold, both for the country that sent them and for themselves. Many veterans of the battle, in later accounts and interviews, expressed a genuine and lasting frustration with how the fighting itself came to be remembered, feeling that the controversy over the hill's abandonment and the political fallout that followed overshadowed the actual courage and sacrifice the fighting itself had required. They had done exactly what had been asked of them under conditions of genuine and sustained danger, against an enemy that had prepared and defended its position with real skill. And many felt that the political narrative that eventually attached itself to the battle reduced their own service to a symbol of policy failure rather than an honest account of what individual soldiers had actually endured and accomplished on that mountain. At the same time, many of these same veterans, in later reflection, came to a complicated peace with the broader questions the battle had raised, understanding that their own frustration with how the battle was remembered did not require them to defend every decision made about how it was fought. They had climbed that hill because their orders required it, and they had done so with real courage, and the legitimate questions later raised about whether that specific hill, at that specific cost, had actually been worth taking did not diminish what they themselves had done in answering the orders they were given, and many carried, for the rest of their lives, a specific and lasting respect for the North Vietnamese soldiers who had defended that mountain with such discipline and such skill, an enemy whose preparation and determination had made this battle as costly as it became. This respect did not require agreeing with the cause those soldiers fought for, and it did not diminish the genuine grief many American veterans carried for friends lost on that mountain. It reflected, instead, the same professional recognition this whole series has described in other contexts, extended between soldiers who had faced each other at close range under conditions that tested both sides as severely as any engagement of that entire war. Here is what the battle for Ap Bia Mountain actually revealed and why the name American soldiers gave it mattered more, in the end, than the hill's official military designation ever did. 4 years earlier, in a different valley, American commanders had studied a similarly costly battle and drawn a confident conclusion that a favorable casualty ratio sustained consistently enough would eventually make the war mathematically unwinnable for North Vietnam. That earlier battle at Ia Drang had launched a strategy of attrition pursued with real conviction for years afterward. Hamburger Hill fought under nearly identical tactical logic and producing a casualty ratio every bit as favorable to American forces, revealed exactly how much had changed in the years between those two battles, not in the mathematics of the casualty exchange itself, but in what the American public and government were still willing to accept as justification for that mathematics. That is the real meaning behind the name soldiers gave this hill, and it reaches well past one mountain in one valley in May 1969. A battle can be won by every conventional military measure and still mark the moment a war's continuation becomes politically and morally unsustainable if the specific cost of that victory becomes vivid and personal enough to the people ultimately paying for it. The soldiers who fought on Ap Bia Mountain did not choose the name they gave it lightly, and they did not choose it to make a political statement about the broader war. They chose it because it was the truest word available for what 10 assaults up the same slope had actually felt like, and that honest, blunt naming, more than any official report, is what carried the real weight of that battle back to a country increasingly unwilling to keep paying it. The soldier who stood on that summit after the 10th assault did not know in that exhausted moment that the hill would be abandoned within weeks, or that his commander's call sign would become a symbol of everything a tired nation had grown to resent about a war it no longer fully believed it could or should keep fighting this way. He knew only that the machine grinding up that mountain had very nearly ground up him and everyone around him too, and that no official name for that hill would ever capture what actually happened there as honestly as the one he and his fellow soldiers had already given it themselves. That is why American soldiers called their own objective a meat grinder, not because the hill demanded it, because that was simply, finally, the truest name left for what taking it had actually cost. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the honest, blunt names soldiers gave their own experience when no official report could capture it as truthfully on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, at Hamburger Hill, or anywhere else in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.